Welcome back, everybody, from the intermission. I hope that nobody. I wonder if anybody else is annoyed by the fact that unless you subscribe and pay Spreaker so much a month that you have to wait 15 minutes between shows. Is anyone else pissed off by that? Because I love being able to do shows in succession, but having to wait 15 minutes is just kind of lame. Anyways, you're listening to James Krasnerick here on Real Steel Sports. Here for Real Steel Sports, should I say? With another live broadcast on Spreaker Web Radio. In my previous show, I went through the common modern day bracket for the NFL quarterbacks in NFL.com's quarterback bracketology. And in this segment, I will be doing Generation X, which is the generation that would face off in this bracket. See, right now bracket will play generation bracket in the Final Four, and millennials will take on the baby boomers. In Generation X bracket, we've got a very interesting matchups. We've got Joe Montana versus Phil Simms. We have Joe Montana versus Boomer Esiason. Pardon me. Dan Marino versus Phil Simms. Jim Kelly versus Warren Moon. And John Elway versus Dan Fouts. So let's start with the top. We got Joe Montana versus Boomer Esiason. I don't think there's any doubt that Joe Montana is better than Boomer Esiason. Boomer, nice guy, great analyst on the CBS NFL Today show, but come on, he's got nothing on Joe Montana. Lost to him in a Super Bowl, but gave Montana a better game in a Super Bowl than Elway, Marino, or Ken Anderson did. Three guys that are ultimately thought of as better. Two guys thought of as much better as their Hall of Famers, and one guy thought of as on his equal, if not even slightly better, in Ken Anderson. But Joe Montana easily wins this. More consistent, great clutch abilities, 4 Super Bowl rings, 0 losses in Super Bowls, didn't throw an interception in the Super Bowl. You got to go with Montana. The next matchup we will see is the number 2 ranked Dan Marino and number 7th ranked Phil Simms. Now, Phil Simms is a lot better than people thinks he is, because Phil Simms had some really good years in New York, won a Super Bowl, had one of the greatest postseason performances in Super Bowl in NFL history with his 22-25 completion percentage performance in Super Bowl 21 against the Denver Broncos. But that's kind of where it ends. This is one of the more one-sided first rounds because Denver, pretty much had no defense that day, and he kind of just tore right through them. But then you got Dan Marino. And Dan Marino is, in all honesty, the greatest quarterback to never win a championship. I think there are quarterbacks better than him that won NFL titles but not Super Bowls, i.e. Otto Graham, but that's a different story. Dan Marino is much better than Phil Simms. The leadership abilities, strong arm, could throw the ball with more velocity, more effectiveness, more of a pocket presence, more of a leader, and look at the numbers. All you got to do is look at the numbers, and it's just ridiculous how much better he was. Dan Marino, 420 touchdown passes, compared to Phil Simms, 199. Yeah, he threw more interceptions, but again, a lot more starts, a lot more passes, a lot more plays, and a lot more snaps than Phil Simms. Marino is easily the better of the two quarterbacks. It's not even close. Next, we have John Elway and Dan Fouts, an old AFC West duel. This is one that's actually a little closer than you would think, because even though Elway did win his 2 Super Bowls, he doesn't win 2 Super Bowls without Terrell Davis. He doesn't win 2 Super Bowls without Mike Shanahan's offensive line scheme. If it had been a different coach and a different running back, we might not have seen Elway ever get to another Super Bowl after the loss to the 49ers in Super Bowl 24, where they lost by 45 points. That being said, though, in the clutch, there's no quarterback you'd rather have than John Elway. 47 career fourth quarter comebacks. How many times was he down by 2-3 touchdowns? I mean, look at his rookie year against the Baltimore Colts, the team that he spurned for the Denver Broncos because he didn't want to play for the Colts. He trails 19-0 in the fourth quarter, comes back, beats him 21-19. What does that say about the guy? Even as a rookie, the seeds had been planted for clutch greatness. He's the greatest clutch quarterback that I ever saw. The ability that he had to bring a team back from the brink of elimination and lead him to a victory is just nothing like anything I've ever seen. I mean, we look at today's clutch quarterbacks. You look at Tom Brady. You look at Ben Roethlisberger. He's probably a hybrid of the two of them. He's got that pocket ability and that pocket awareness like a Tom Brady, but he's so good on the run and he can shrug off defenders like a Ben Roethlisberger. He's so good at what he did. He was the best clutch quarterback I ever saw. But Dan Fouts is very underrated in NFL history because he played with one of the more interesting offensive arrays in NFL history. They didn't even try to run the ball. They had Kellen Winslow, they had John Jefferson, they had, just if you look at the guys who were played for Air Coryell, Charlie Joyner was a Hall of Famer, Kellen Winslow, Hall of Famer, Dan Fouts, the quarterback, a Hall of Famer. They had so many great guys. I mean, Wes Chandler in 1982 had 1,032 receiving yards in a 9-game season. That's incredible in a 9-game season. I mean, actually, I take that back. The numbers were the same, but he only played in 8 of those games. So he averaged 129 yards a game that year. You factor that over a full season, that's over 2,000 yards receiving. That's incredible. Not too many receivers were as good as what the Chargers had. And again, that kind of, I think, works against Dan Fouts, but at the same time, it was part of his greatness. And the fact that, he was so good, he could make those guys look good. So I got to give him a lot of credit. But at the same time, does he really compare to John Elway, the clutch master? Elway's career was so long, and at the end of his career, making a couple Pro Bowls and have a pretty good statistical couple seasons at the end of his career when he won his 2 rings. You look at Dan Fouts' end of his career, it was mired in mediocrity. So in that case, if you wanted to go by that, of course, you got to take Dan Fouts over. You got to take John Elway over Dan Fouts. And finally, the final matchup in the first round, Warren Moon versus Jim Kelly. This is one where, even though Kelly's been in 4 Super Bowls, you kind of have to toss a coin on it because Warren Moon was incredibly underrated. If you count the Canadian Football League and his NFL statistics, he would have thrown for a lot more yards than even Brett Favre. And Brett Favre threw for over 70,000. What does that tell you? That tells you the guy was prolific, the guy could make plays. But if you really came down to it, what he was really good at was just being consistent over a long period of time. You look at what he averaged throughout his career. I mean, his career yards per game average is 237. Now that doesn't sound like much, but if you look at the era he was in, Jim Kelly's almost 20 yards less. The only guys who are leaving that same class is Dan Marino. Warren Moon threw for so many yards, and he had to win 5 Grey Cups before the NFL even gave him a tryout. And once they did, they knew how good this guy really could be. My honest opinion is that he's just as good as any of the quarterbacks that did win a Super Bowl. And facing another guy who was better than a lot of quarterbacks who did win Super Bowls, Jim Kelly. Now, Jim Kelly was pretty consistent, had a bunch of really good years in his career. He initially played in the USFL for the Houston Gamblers, I believe they were called, until they folded and then he joined the Bills. But, again, an all-pro season, 91, 5 Pro Bowls. Born and raised in Pittsburgh. Gotta love him for that. But I think he does win this matchup because of the fact he was in 4 Super Bowls. And that really does work to his advantage. And the fact that Warren Moon had some good teams, not quite the offensive personnel that the Buffalo Bills had in Jim Kelly's era. And even though that kind of makes this matchup more even because, you say, hey, Warren Moon, you put them on the same team, who would do more? I think Kelly would do more because of one reason only. Because Jim Kelly, like Ben Roethlisberger, I mentioned in my previous segment, was so good at throwing in bad weather. Honestly, Jim Kelly's just a slightly smaller version of Ben Roethlisberger. He's big, physical. His nickname was Darryl Talley, the linebacker for the Buffalo Bills. They had the nickname for Jim Kelly. It was Heathcliff, he's a cat who thinks he's a dog. And I think that really does fit the description of Jim Kelly perfectly. He's a quarterback, yes, but he acts like a linebacker or a running back. He's big, he's physical, he's strong. And again, he's just a smaller version of Ben Roethlisberger. Now, I think that does work to his advantage because the fact that they played in Buffalo, and if you've ever seen winter in Buffalo, the wind, the snow, the cold, and Jim Kelly had so many good years playing half the season in Buffalo. Of the 8 games they played at home every year, you can imagine probably 4 of them were just in absolutely horrid weather conditions. Then you count the playoffs on top of that. And if you look at his postseason game log at home, pretty impressive. He's had a bunch of games where he's put up a lot of points. The first year they went to the Super Bowl as a team, beating Buffalo, beating Oakland, and beat LA Raiders, I should say, and the Miami Dolphins, putting up 44 points and 51 points. Then you look at some games where, blew out the Kansas City Chiefs, beat the Raiders again, beat the Chiefs again, beat the Dolphins. He's so good at playing in that cold weather and getting the ball to his receivers, even in the midst of all of those elements. So I think Kelly wins this matchup by default, and because of the fact he's been in a Super Bowl. He's been in 4, and Warren Moon never got past the AFC title game. In fact, I'm not even sure he actually ever made it to the NFC title game, for that matter. So that leaves the last 4 in this bracket: Joe Montana versus Jim Kelly, and John Elway versus Dan Marino. Joe Montana is much better than Jim Kelly. Let's not even go there. It's kind of funny because talking about this bracket, 3 of the 4 guys came from Pittsburgh: Montana, Kelly, and Marino. So I guess they're repping the Steel City with pride. But Montana, again, I said it before, 4-0 Super Bowls, never threw a pick in a Super Bowl. Jim Kelly, 0-4 in Super Bowls, more picks and touchdowns in the Super Bowl. That's all you need to know to do this matchup. And the fact that, yes, I know Montana played with better teams than Jim Kelly, but Jim Kelly's teams were good enough to win a Super Bowl, and they did not. Joe Montana's teams, he had a couple teams that were kind of average. The 88 and the 81 teams were good. They weren't nothing that special, even though the 81 team won 13 games, which was the most in the league. It doesn't matter. Joe Montana still got them to a couple of Super Bowls and still got them to win those 2. And then in 84 and 89, they were pretty damn impressive. 2 of the best teams the league's ever seen. So I guess you have to give the edge to Montana by a large margin. And the other one, we've got John Elway versus Dan Marino. I would take Elway over Marino any day of the week because of the clutch factor. Because of the fact that Elway can move, make some plays on the run if he has to, can get a couple first downs with his legs. Marino can't do that. Marino's arm is probably stronger. He's more accurate as a passer. But people will like to talk about these 2 quarterbacks. And I'll talk about that light by saying this. And this is putting it nicely. They probably, of them all the quarterbacks that have ever played in NFL history that were Hall of Famers, had the worst offensive staff around them in their heydays. I know for a time Elway had Rod Smith,